Welcome to IMPACT's webinar series. IMPACT is a clinical trial training platform funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research to increase capacity for clinical trials with children and pregnant people in Canada. This webinar was developed for anyone who wants to learn more about clinical trials. You can share it and register online to attend future webinars live. Our free webinars will continue to cover cutting-edge topics in pediatric and perinatal clinical trials. To learn more about future webinars, visit our website www.impacttrials.ca. After the webinar, we invite you to check out other IMPACT Knowledge Hub resources on dual code. These include courses on a wide variety of introductory and intermediary topics in clinical trials. All IMPACT courses are created and peer-reviewed by experts from across Canada and provide certificates of completion. We hope you enjoy this free and educational content brought to you by IMPACT. To learn more about working with us, you can find our contact information online.
Welcome to today's webinar on responsible research practices, how reporting guidelines can help improve child health trials. My name is Nancy Butcher and I'm the co-director of IMPACT. Today, we would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Ami Baba, who is a senior project manager at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. Ami's work is focused on improving the transparency, quality, and utility of child health clinical research. Ami is the lead author of pediatric-specific reporting guideline extensions for trial protocols, trial reports, as well as systematic reviews. We will also have Dr. Martin Offringa joining us today, who is the PI of these projects and the senior scientist from the Hospital for Sick Children. So today, Ami, followed by Martin, will present for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about a 10 to 15-minute period for general discussions and questions from the audience on the webinar. Following that, we will have a 30-minute closed discussion period between Dr. Baba and Dr. Offringa and the IMPACT Fellows. So if there are any learners on the call today that are from any of our partner networks, such as Rare Kids Can or Popcorn or former IMPACT Fellows who want to join in on that discussion period, you're very welcome to. Please just send Chelsea a Zoom message so that we can make sure to give you access to that portion of the session today. Just a few housekeeping things. Today's presentation will be provided in English. If you would like to enable the Zoom live transcription feature, you can do so by using the toolbar at the bottom of your screen and then just selecting your preferred language. And before we begin with the session, I would like to open today's session with a land acknowledgement. On a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous people of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and to become engaged allies together. We as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. It's now my pleasure to hand things over to Dr. Baba to begin today's presentation. Welcome, Ami.
Thank you, Nancy, for the introduction, and thank you, IMPACT, for having me today to talk about responsible research practices in pediatric trials. So today, to start off this webinar, I want to go over the objectives of today. So we have three main objectives. The first, we want to identify who needs trial reporting guidelines. I will also introduce pediatric-specific reporting guideline extensions for trials and systematic reviews, and we'll also describe how Spirit C, Consort C, Tidier C, and Prisma C can impact both upstream and downstream research processes. So today we'll go over all of this in 10 steps, and the links to the articles that are discussed in today's webinar will be shared with all of you after the webinar. So to start off with, I want everyone to kind of think about this first question I have for all of you, is whether your research is useful. So in 2016, a paper was published called Why Most Clinical Research is Not Useful. And in this paper, John Ioannidis argued that most clinical trials and systematic reviews that have been published are not useful. But he also presented 8 different clinical features of useful clinical research to consider and how to make your research more useful. So we don't have enough time to talk about all 8 features, but we will be focusing on the last feature here on transparency, because the usefulness of research is decreased when research is not reported transparently and comprehensively. So we'll talk about how reporting guidelines can help in increasing the transparency of research and also in the usefulness of all of your work. So in 2024, a different review was published assessing the usefulness of child health randomized control trials that were published in 2007, between 2007 and 2017. And this paper examined the 8 features of clinical usefulness that was introduced earlier today, and found that for these RCTs that were published in this 10-year period, while there has been improvements in all 8 features, there's still a lot of areas that need a great deal of improvement. So reporting is a key part of how we could improve the usefulness of research. So I'll discuss more about how reporting guidelines play a role in this. So now we should think about who needs trial reporting guidelines. So I think traditionally, a lot of people tend to think that reporting guidelines are used mostly by trial protocol authors or reports or those who are preparing manuscripts. But in reality, actually, the high quality research reporting is not the responsibility of just authors, but it is a responsibility that is shared across the entire research ecosystem and all of the end users that are involved. So this includes other research interest holders such as journal editors, publishers, and peer reviewers, funders and academic institutions, and of course, trainees and patient, public, and trial participants. And if everyone is aware of the issues with suboptimal reporting and the reporting guidelines or tools that are available to reduce research waste, and also the minimal detail that should be reported, there could be more improvements in the usefulness of research. So I'll talk more about how different user groups can benefit and use these guidelines. So on this slide here, it's table 2 from the SPIRIT-C guideline, which I'll introduce in more detail later today. For SPIRIT-C, it is the trial protocol reporting guideline, but the lessons in this table 2 is applicable not just for SPIRIT-C, but other reporting guidelines as well. And in this table, we show the different key groups such as authors, funders, trial registries and research staff, and their implementable actions and the resulting potential benefits. So in more detail here, typically, again, we think about authors as the main users of these reporting guidelines, but also funders as well, and research ethics boards and trial registries. So if these groups use and adhere to these guidelines, this can result in better reporting of key minimum sets of details that are really important to understand what was done and what was found and what the results mean. And it would also result in the inclusion of details that were identified as important by, for example, young people and family caregivers, because they were involved in developing SPIRIT-C and these pediatric specific reporting guideline extensions. When funders and ethics boards and trial registries endorse and also require the use of these reporting guidelines, it sets consistent standards on what information should be included, which ultimately enhances the completeness and the quality and the consistency of funding applications as well as research ethics applications, so that it is easy to understand what details should be included as a standard. Other groups here that I want to highlight, an important group, the patients, public, and trial participant groups. We may not typically think of them as a group that would use reporting guidelines, but actually, if they are aware of these guidelines and are familiar with reporting guidelines, it can really enable them to be able to understand what information they should expect to find in a trial protocol or even a report. And this is really critical because these protocols and reports are something that patients and their families really consider when making important healthcare decisions for themselves or also for their families. Knowing about these guidelines and using them can help them and advocate for the responsible use of public funds, because a lot of research is conducted using public funds. And ultimately, with better reporting, we could increase the trust and accountability in how research is conducted. So a little bit more about how young people and families can use and benefit from reporting guidelines. This is a JAMA Pediatrics patient page that was published alongside the Spirit C and Consort C guidelines. And it is really targeted towards young people and parents, and highlights how these guidelines were developed with young people and family caregivers, but also on what details they can expect and should expect to read in these reports. For example, details on how a trial intervention was delivered and whether a support person was needed, or what potential ways were taken into account when thinking about the fear, pain, or distress that a trial may cause. So this infographic here really nicely illustrates what kind of details that parents and young people can really expect to see if reporting guidelines are adhered to. So in February 2026, the Lancet group posted this, and they stated that it is a new era for child and adolescent health research. And this was in response to the publication of the Spirit C and Consort C reporting guidelines, because up until February 2026, there were no reporting guidelines that were specific for pediatric trials. So while there are many different reporting guidelines that are available, these reporting guidelines that existed prior to the publication of Spirit and Consort C didn't explicitly consider the needs and the unique considerations that need to be thought about when working with child and adolescents in trials. And in response to these Spirit C and Consort C publications, there were a number of different editorials and commentaries that were published that really stressed the importance and the potential that Spirit C and Consort C has in being able to improve the pediatric specific evidence base, and also highlights that using Spirit C and Consort C can be a cost-effective way and an immediate way that we could increase the quality and usefulness of pediatric research. In addition, there has been some changes in some major pediatric journals in terms of their instructions for authors. These journals that are shown on this slide here, such as JAMA Pediatrics and The Lancet, and Pediatric Research and the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology and Practice, all endorse and now require authors to adhere to the Spirit C and Consort C guidelines for any publications of trial protocols and reports that involve children and adolescents. So you may be wondering why we need pediatric-specific reporting guidelines, especially again because there are so many reporting guidelines that are already available. But this is because when working with children and adolescents, there are unique pediatric considerations that need to be taken into account and are currently missing from trial protocols and reports and publications. So when working with children, we can't really choose and proceed with a one-size-fits-all approach, because we need to consider the different age and developmentally appropriate methods for how to conduct a trial, and also in designing the trial and ultimately reporting these specific details. So for example, how an intervention is delivered to a very young child may not be the same way in how we deliver it to a teenager. For example, very young children may struggle in swallowing capsules or pills. Moreover, outcomes need to also be carefully considered, because what is considered as a meaningful outcome and what is relevant may not be the same for all age groups and developmental stages. And the way that we are measuring these outcomes also need to be validated for the particular target population. In addition, a lot of these other details that we need to consider are any differences in treatment effects or whether any special considerations were taken in consenting and the assent processes in the trials involving these young populations, and any harms mitigations, and of course, if long-term follow-up is needed because this population is growing and changing rapidly. However, because the existing reporting guidelines do not consider these unique considerations explicitly, a lot of these details are not comprehensively reported in trial protocols and reports, which necessitates the need for guidelines such as SPIRIT and CONSORT C. And a little bit more about the impacts of the suboptimal reporting. So if we don't take into account these unique pediatric considerations in the reporting, it really becomes difficult for the end users of the research to determine if a treatment works well and for what age groups or what developmental stages it is working best for and whether it is safe. And also the applicability of treatments becomes difficult to really understand. This in turn also affects the quality and utility of systematic reviews because if details are not clearly reported, then it is difficult to summarize all the existing evidence on a specific intervention, which then in turn affects clinical practice guidelines and policies and the availability of effective treatments. So the suboptimal reporting of these key details will lead to research waste. And this is really unfortunate, especially when working with children and adolescents, because there are already so few trials that are involving these young populations. So part of the solution is to improve the reporting. And so therefore, we worked on developing pediatric specific reporting guideline extensions to really help authors to report the minimum set of key information that are really important for children and adolescents. So we developed 4 different reporting guideline extensions. So SPIRIT C for pediatric trial protocols. We have CONSORT C for pediatric trial reports, and then TIDIER C for pediatric trial interventions, and lastly, PRISMA C for systematic reviews of interventions in pediatrics. And I will introduce all of them in more detail in the coming slides. So the first set that I'll be introducing to all of you today is the SPIRIT C and CONSORT C guidelines. So again, these are for trial protocols and reports and are for those trials that are involving children and adolescents ages 0 to 19 years. So SPIRIT C and CONSORT C were developed simultaneously, so it is harmonized across the trial protocol stage all the way to the trial report stage. So the items are complementing one another and flows naturally to guide authors from the upstream processes all the way downstream. The key part of SPIRIT and CONSORT C is that we involve young people and family caregivers in developing these 2 guidelines. So young people ages 10 to 24 years and also family caregivers were involved throughout the different stages, such as in coming up with candidate reporting items. Family caregivers, for example, were part of the Delphi and also as co-authors on the statement papers and the E&E documents, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. So at the bottom of this infographic, you can see that SPIRIT C has 17 new items specifically for pediatric trial protocols and includes the 4 youth-generated items. And then downstream, CONSORT C is for trial reports and has 13 new items, and one of them is youth-generated. And here, this figure here really nicely highlights and summarizes the cross-cutting pediatric themes that are illustrated in both SPIRIT C and CONSORT C. So it's important to note that because SPIRIT C and CONSORT C are extensions, they extend the main SPIRIT and CONSORT 2025 guidelines. So all of the new reporting items are placed within the existing sections and topics of the main guidelines. But these cross-cutting themes are really unique to the pediatric population and are the novel additions of the Spirit and Consort C reporting guidelines. So, for example, one of the new reporting items are specific to the background and rationale, and authors are asked to describe the justification for undertaking the trial in children and adolescents. And this really addresses the age and development, such as who is included and why we are conducting a trial in a pediatric population, and also details on like the age groups and the age ranges that are involved. Moving on, we also have we have items about the intervention and comparator specifically. So one of the items asks authors to specifically detail the intervention dose and the formulation that is appropriate for the trial population, and whether there were any adjustments made based on the age, weight, and body surface area. So authors are asked to really specify the pediatric dose and any adjustments made to the formulation. And there is also an item that asks authors to describe whether interventions were delivered with support from a support person, such as a parent or even a teacher. There are also items specific to outcomes. So items that are addressing the outcome validity as well as the different measurement properties of outcome measurement instruments. And also ask authors to really think about the choice and justify whether these measures are appropriate for the age as well as the target population. There's also a specific item about the experience and harms of children in the trial. An item asks whether trial interventions and procedures induce fear, pain, and distress or are invasive, and what measures are taken to mitigate this. So this really necessitates the need to think about what trial participation and what the experience is like for these children and adolescents, and whether any plans were made to reduce any of these negative experiences. And of course, partnership and transparency. In the explanation and elaboration documents for both of these guidelines, we elaborate a little bit more on the pediatric considerations on describing young people and family caregiver involvement in the design, the conduct, and the reporting of the trial, and also how the research will affect end users such as our young patients and their families. So a little bit more about how young people and family caregivers were involved in the development of Spirit C and Consort C. I mentioned it a little bit previously, but they were very involved throughout the whole development process. And because of their involvement, there was emphasis on family and patient-centered care. So particularly for items that concern consent and assent, or pain reduction and reducing harms, in the E&E, their expertise and their perspectives really enriched the explanations for why it's important to address these elements in your trial protocol or report. In addition, in Spirit C and Consort C, they both have youth-generated and youth-endorsed items. So youth-generated items are those that young people came up with themselves during young people reporting guideline workshops that we conducted in 5 different countries, in Canada, France, England, Spain, and Scotland. And young people helped in coming up with candidate reporting items that were later voted on and then also decided on through consensus. These youth endorsed items are also these items that young people thought of during the workshops, but were already items that were included in the candidate reporting item list. So their experiences and their impact, as well as the identified key enablers in effectively involving young people and family caregivers in reporting guideline development, are detailed in this paper at the bottom of the slide, published in Research Involvement and Engagement. So now thinking about how to efficiently use Spirit C and Consort C. So we prepared a number of different resources as well as publications to really help users best to use these guidelines. So the statement papers were co-published in the BMJ, JAMA Pediatrics, and the Lancet Child and Adolescent Health. And as part of the supplement of these two papers, the downloadable checklists are also available for both SPIRIT-C and CONSORT-C. Separately, we also published the explanation and elaboration papers for both of these guidelines, and they are available and published in the BMJ. These E&E papers are really helpful for users to get a good idea of why each new reporting item was included and why it should be reported in your papers, and also provides good reporting examples from published papers as well. And it also has pediatric considerations for 6 SPIRIT 2025 items and 8 CONSORT 2025 items, particularly for key topics that are very relevant to pediatric trials, such as patient and public involvement, the intervention and comparators, outcomes, and harms. So this E&E is a very, very useful resource. We also prepared other resources as well. So on the SPIRIT-C and CONSORT-C website, we put these tip sheets for each of the new reporting items. So these tip sheets go over each item as well as the key elements for reporting and an example of good reporting as well. On the website, we also have a short informational video about these guidelines and also the infographic that I shared a few slides back. Okay, now switching gears to trial interventions. So we also developed a reporting guideline that is specific for pediatric trial interventions, and we worked on extending the Tidier guideline. So Tidier Children and Adolescents adds 13 pediatric considerations to consider when reporting trial interventions. And it really builds on the 12 Tidier items. And Tidier-C was published in Pediatrics, and it is intended to support the transparent reporting of both the experimental and comparator trial interventions and trial protocols and reports, because in past publications, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the details that are reported for the interventions, but particularly for the comparator interventions, usually there's not much detail provided at all because it's described as like usual care, but as we know, this could be very different depending on the study site or even country. So Tidier-C really is aimed to improve the understandability of all of these key details and also the replicability and implementation of effective trial interventions. So on this next slide here, this details all of the different Tidier-C pediatric considerations embedded within the Tidier items here. So you can see that for Tidier-C, we have pediatric considerations on the why of the intervention, as well as the what for the materials and the procedures, and details on who provided the intervention, how, where, when, and how much, and also tailoring. So for more details about each of the Tidier-C pediatric considerations, it is all detailed in the Tidier-C paper, which also provides good reporting examples for each of these pediatric considerations and also the explanation. And for these Tidier items that don't have a PC or a pediatric consideration, the Tidier-C paper provides examples that are specific to the child and adolescent population as well. So the final reporting guideline that I will be introducing to everyone today is the PRISMA-C guideline. So PRISMA-C extends the PRISMA 2020 guideline for systematic reviews. And PRISMA-C is for systematic reviews of pediatric interventions. And it adds 7 new reporting items about the title and the introduction and the methods and results and the discussion. And in this next slide here, you could see some of the new items that were added. So here at the top, there is one that asks authors to explicitly identify that the systematic review is pediatric. And also here in the introduction section, there are two about more details and justification for included age groups and ranges and developmental stages, and in describing the potential differences and similarities in treatment effects related to age or development. In addition to the 7 new items, Prisma-C also adds 4 abstract items, but also something unique to Prisma-C is these ontogeny statement items. So it's these sections that are circled in red. These ontogeny statement items are Prisma 2020 items that are already existing, so they weren't new ones that are added to Prisma-C. But I will detail more what the ontogeny statement is. So the ontogeny statement is a guiding kind of principle that asks authors to consider reporting the information separately for all included pediatric age groups or ranges, where applicable and relevant as determined by the investigators. So for 10 of the existing Prisma 2020 items that was determined to really benefit from granular reporting based on age groups or ranges, particularly when multiple age groups are involved, we indicated these clearly as ontogeny statement items. So we have items from Prisma 2020 about the objectives, as well as the eligibility criteria, and of course in the methods and the results and the discussion. And the purpose of the ontogeny statement is to really prevent the pooling of data without considering the developmental differences that we see in children and adolescents. And it facilitates the interpretation of treatment effects and safety for each group. And so we could see more of this in detail on this infographic here. So there's always a challenge when we are working with children and young people because they are rapidly growing and developing, which results in very different changes in how they respond to different treatments. And the risk is that if we pull all the data together from diverse age groups without considering these differences, this could lead to the masking of treatment effects or even to overestimations. And a lot of the times, these essential details on subgroup justifications or analyses has not been reported clearly in systematic reviews in the past. So Prisma-C really aims to tackle this challenge through the new items, but also through the ontogeny statement. And by asking authors to be very specific and precise in defining their age groups with clear age ranges. So instead of just saying children or adolescents and not defining the age ranges, authors should really clearly define their groups, such as 0 to 12 months or 8 to 12 years. We recognize that sometimes in specific conditions with like chronic conditions, neurodevelopmental conditions, or any diseases or conditions that impact organ maturation and development, age groups and age ranges may not be the most informative. So in these instances, authors are asked to kind of do their reporting based on disease-specific staging instead, such as disease stage, severity, or subtype. And this will also apply to the ontogeny statement. So using Prisma-C 2026, we published a paper in the BMJ. Instead of having one statement paper and one E&E paper, it's all combined in one paper, so you could find the examples as well as the explanations for each of the new items in this one paper. The downloadable checklist is also available as a supplement. And on the Prisma-C website, we prepared separate resources such as tip sheets and a video, and also the infographic on the previous page is available online. So shifting gears now and thinking more generally about research as a whole, systematic reviews and meta-analyses are typically seen as the gold standard of evidence synthesis. But kind of thinking about everything we've been talking about today, if the processes prior to the systematic reviews, such as RCTs, are not designed, conducted, or reported clearly, then the systematic reviews that are conducted will be flawed because the quality of systematic reviews is really dependent on the input and the RCTs that are included and the other studies as well. So we really need to think about how we could make sure that all of the details that are needed for high quality systematic reviews are reported. And also because systematic reviews are key in also deciding whether a trial is needed. In this editorial here that was published in the PMJ, this really highlights how we need to think about reporting guidelines as not just checklists that should be used at the very end of the research process, such as when you're writing your manuscript, but it has to really be considered in the upstream research processes as well, because there's only so much a reporting guideline can do if the methods are not done properly in the earlier stages of the research. So at the top here, it says reporting that an item has been addressed does not mean it has been done well, because if we aren't considering how to design and conduct our trials properly, there's only so much that reporting can do at the very end. So this slide here, I want to introduce Martin and welcome him to talk a little bit more about his experiences with pediatric research and trials.
Thank you, Ami, and hello, everyone. My name's Martin, and I'm working at SickKids in Toronto. And this pic is a picture of a place not so far away from Toronto that I've been many times with my friends and family. These are obviously the Niagara Falls. And it occurred to me over the years, Ami, that you can visit this place many, many times from the downstream end, like we do here. You know, we're on the Maid of the Mist, and we're visiting the falls from the downstream end. But you can only actually visit it from the upstream end only once. And this is what I sort of realized when I looked back, and Ami asked me to look back at my career in multi-center clinical trials in child health. That, you know, to design and to conduct a trial sometimes feel like a roller coaster, or being, you know, on a waterfall and going down. And then once you've done it and you've reached the end of it, you can look back and spend the rest of your life and your career looking back on how you would have liked, you know, things to have gone differently. How your decisions, like upstream there, you know, over the horizon, you can't see actually what decisions have been made there in designing the study and involving patients and talking about all these aspects that Ami has just reviewed for us. You can't do it again. So I think it's great to be a trialist in 2026, because now at least you know what to expect, you know what you need to report downstream. And so I was asking Ami, you know, how can this reporting business then improve maybe decisions upstream, and that you know that you're not going to regret, you know, and looking back on your career and looking back on your studies for the rest of your life, but that you have a little bit more control. Ami, what is your response to that?
Thanks, Martin. So I really want to now talk about how we should consider these reporting guidelines, not just when we are writing our manuscripts, but also in the upstream stages of the research, as Martin has described a little bit with his experience. So the point here is that considering guidelines only at the manuscript stage can't fix the deficiencies that we see downstream already, and that has already occurred upstream. So we want to kind of start thinking about needing to be aware of these guidelines prior to the manuscript writing stage so that it could indirectly influence the research processes upstream, such as the research design, conduct, and analysis. So in this slide here, this shows like different research stages or research stations in this figure. So I want to describe a little bit more about this figure here. It's a little bit complicated, but in the dashed lines, this is where we could kind of expand the scope of reporting guidelines beyond like a reporting guideline that we use during the manuscript writing stage. So for example, if we look at the trial analysis stage here, Consort C for trial reports would typically be used while we're writing up our trial report after we're done our analysis and preparing our trial publication and thinking about sharing our results. But if we start thinking about and referring to Consort C even before trial analysis, so during the trial design and as well as the trial conduct stage, then we could really already be aware of the key elements that we need to report in the trial publication. But this can also influence how we think about different elements for our trial, such as mitigating harms in our trial participants. So this is really applicable also for the other reporting guidelines here, such as Spirit C and gray, and then also Prisma C and orange here. So this figure really shows how there's upstream and downstream impacts of all of these reporting guidelines beyond just writing your manuscript. So kind of shifting the focus to thinking about sharing results beyond trial reports or academic publications. When we're thinking about our research, we also have to consider who we're doing the research for and who these trials are for. And it's really important to think about whether these trials are informative. So informative trials are defined as when clinical trials are designed, conducted, and also mobilized in ways that results are useful for decision-making and future research. So when trial participants participate in a trial, they often share that they want to know what happened as a result of their participation. So this really stresses the fact that it's important to think about communicating and sharing trial results back to trial participants. And this goes beyond trial protocols and reports because we need to communicate results in a way that is understandable for our end users so that they can use it in their healthcare decision making. And in this call to action published in Pediatrics, we discuss a little bit about the why and the how of how to do this and emphasize that planning and intentionality is needed to think about what resources you'll need and how you plan to share results at the very end of your study. So one of the tools that we introduce in this call to action is Communikits. And this is a plain language summary results template that was developed with young people and family caregivers. And this is important because this template was developed considering the unique knowledge needs and preferences of young people and their families when they are receiving trial results. So this is available as part of the Clinical Trial Ontario's Participant Experience Toolkit. And then in this next slide, we could see Communikits in action, and it is populated with results from a pediatric migraine trial, and also shows these different sections that young people and families really valued. So for example, young people really stress the importance of having a thank you section at the top and having a clear executive summary so readers can see at a glance the results as well as the next steps. And also these different sections, making it very easy for readers to find the information they're looking for. And coming full circle, we also have to think about trustworthiness because these days there is a lot of publications that are being published, and there are concerns about whether all of these publications are trustworthy and whether they're accurate. So there has been a lot of conversations and discussions about the need to check for trustworthiness. And this can be done at different stages of the research process. But typically, these checks for trustworthiness includes looking for details about ethics or registration and funding and data sharing. So concepts about open science, as well as the different methods and results elements that are considered. So again, knowing and using reporting guidelines before even writing your manuscript can help in addressing these details that are checked and assessed in determining whether your trial is trustworthy. And finally, last week, a commentary was published in the Journal of Pediatrics, which goes over many of the responsible research practices that we talked about today, and goes over how these reporting guidelines can be used to improve trial design and conduct. And it also gives more details about 4 responsible research practices to consider when working in research involving young people and family caregivers, such as really considering the developmental differences and changes in this young population, thinking about meaningful involvement of children and families as research partners, and of course, using these guidelines early in the research process and thinking about sharing study results back to participants. So in conclusion, trial reporting guidelines can benefit all end users, not just authors, but everyone who are users of research. And these pediatric-specific reporting guidelines are part of the solution to improve the usefulness of trials, but also the trustworthiness and improve the quality of pediatric-specific evidence. And lastly, to consideration of these reporting guidelines upstream in the research process can really maximize study impact. To conclude, I also want to acknowledge all of the contributors and colleagues that were involved in the development of the reporting guidelines that were presented today. Of course, Dr. Martin Ofringa is the PI of all of the work that was presented as part of this webinar. And a very big thank you to the core teams for all of the guidelines and the co-authors, colleagues, and collaborators, and of course, the young people and family caregivers who were involved and generously contributed their expertise and their time in helping us develop these guidelines to be relevant to all end users. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ami, and thank you, Martin, for this excellent presentation and such a comprehensive overview of this suite of tools that you've developed to help support the conduct and the reporting of pediatric clinical trials. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. We do have about 15 minutes now for questions and discussion from the audience. So I'd like to invite everyone on the webinar today who has a question or a comment for Ami or Martin to please go ahead, unmute yourself to ask a question, or you could also type it in the chat. And maybe while folks are thinking about that, I can kick things off because I think one of the things that's really striking about these reporting guidelines is the extent that youth and caregivers were involved in its development. That's a really unique approach in reporting guideline methodology. And I'm wondering if you could comment or share a bit on what you think would have been lost or what was gained by taking this approach and how that worked for the team.
Thank you, Nancy. So young people and family caregivers were very important to the development of these guidelines because we could really see the tangible impacts that they had on these guidelines. First, seeing the youth-generated items. These items weren't considered through like the literature searches or by the items that were generated by expert input, but they were really thought of by young people themselves. So, for example, items about whether a support person was needed for intervention delivery and how their privacy and confidentiality is protected. And also there was an item about how they will be recognized for their trial participation. So these youth-generated items really showed that they had a very big impact on the items that were included. Also, because family caregivers were very key in co-authoring these statement papers and E&Es, it really added and enriched these documents to include like family-centered considerations, particularly for like pain and how to reduce this, like distraction methods, and how to really ease the experience for young participants. So I think these are some of the ways that it really helped with the development of these guidelines.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ami. Right. We have some comments coming through now in the chat. So from Betty is wondering, sorry if you've explained this already. My question is, how do we decide on the two categorization on the 0 to 12 months and 4 to 12-year-old range?
Yeah, let me just clarify a little bit. I'm not sure if we have explained this or I overhear it. I just saw that in the earlier page, I think it's under Spirit C, they mentioned that we want to categorize the age to be, I think one category 0 to 12 months, and the other category, I couldn't recall, is 4 year or something to 12 year. So I'm just wondering, like, is there any reason that's why we categorize these two age? Or, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Buddy, for your question. So, to answer your question, I think this isn't about the infographic on one of the slides with the age groups. So those were just illustrative examples on how age groups could be defined. So we aren't saying that it's 0 to 12 months or 4 to 12 years explicitly. How you define the age groups would really depend on your trial and your population. So it would be also maybe dependent on the definitions that you're adhering to or like the disease stage that you're considering. So the ones on the slides are not like definitive definitions now.
Yeah, thank you.
We have another question in the chat from Rose. So she's asking, in long-term studies of children, how is the transition from assent to the child's own informed consent? And are there established guidelines or recommended approaches? And also what happens to the child's data?
Thank you, Rose, for your question. So this would really, I think this is very variable depending on where you're conducting your trial. Different regulatory bodies and also different jurisdictions have different requirements on consent and assets. So I think this needs to be, it's dependent on where you're doing your trial. So there are guidelines, I believe, and recommendations on thinking about how to do consent and assent and what information should be included in like trial information sheets, for example. So yes, I encourage you to refer to kind of where you're doing your trial and then what happens to the child data. I think this is also very specific to where you would be doing your trial. So different privacy regulations would be available. Martin, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I think that's the answer.
Okay.
There's no one solution, and it's a little bit on the edge of the scope of what we're talking about, but it's an important thing. But it's very fluid, and people are changing the rules every month. So yeah, go to your local or your provincial body and get that information. Unless we completely misunderstood Rose's question, Rose, is this helpful at all?
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking that because we have assent at a certain age, and I believe that in Canada there is a below 18, then that is a child, but this particular child will outgrow, and the transition between these participants into the next phase, what happens in between? That was my question. Do they, I know they're supposed to be reconsented, but I am trying to think if it was a children's study altogether, it means that a whole lot of children will have to be reconsented, or they might stop being part of the study. That's
a good question. But we don't do that every day, and we don't have we're not the experts.
Okay, I understand. Okay.
You can ask me a question about newborns. So going back to Betty's question, the age groups, if you're a neonatologist like myself, is, premature babies, don't pool them with term babies because they got different pharmacology, their liver function is different, their brain is responding differently to the same drugs. So Betty, this is just an example that I want to give you. It's all dependent on the ontogenetic factors within your population that you're studying. If you are a scientist that wants to study kids from 0 to 19 years, you're in trouble because you're looking at potentially 2 or maybe 5 different populations, depending on your drug, on your outcome, on your disease, right? So don't see the examples as absolute. And I don't like to talk about children like, oh, infant, toddler, school child, and that's it. That does only make sense for the newspapers. But for scientists like you guys, you need to understand the biology. It's the biology, the pharmacology, and the way outcomes are measured at different subgroups within your larger population that Ami is talking about. Separate those, and then maybe later you can combine them, but don't assume that you can combine them because they're all children. Sorry, Nancy, I thought that was an opportunity to fill 2 more minutes.
Thanks, Martin. Those are great points. Do we have any other comments or questions from the audience? Okay, if not, I'd like to encourage everyone to take a moment to complete a short evaluation. Chelsea's put the link in the chat. And please join me in thanking Ami and Martin for joining us today and sharing their knowledge and expertise about reporting guidelines.